We will close tonight's program by hearing a presentation about solar energy as it intersects with the sustainability issue, the very important issue of equity. Please welcome Paul to the podium, who will tell us about that project.
Thanks everyone for holding your celebration until I'm done. My name is Pol Lezcano, and it's a pleasure to present to you on behalf of my capstone on our project on SolarOne and the expansion of Here Comes Solar across the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. So just as an overview of what we're going to be talking about, we're going to start with a little bit of an introduction of what Here Comes Solar is and what value it actually brings and our objective with this project. We're going to guide you through the different steps. Step 1 being identifying final candidates for the expansion across the different states. Step 2, conducting a comprehensive city analysis for each of the finalists. And step 3, our final recommendation, along with our conclusion and the next steps. So a little bit on Here Comes Solar. Here Comes Solar is a technical assistance program which basically helps affordable housing communities, multifamily buildings, and underserved communities not only get access to solar, but also understand the benefits of it. So they start by conducting a site assessment of the rooftops and try to understand the potential for solar in terms of system size and irradiation. They then move to educate the decision makers, meaning the affordable housing developers and the owners, in the different benefits of solar, be it environmental, but also economic. And then they guide them through the different financing options as well as ownership structure that they can use in order to make use of the tax benefits associated with solar, as well as other kind of state financial incentives. And finally, if the building decides to move forward and they decide to have a third party owning that system, they run the request for proposals to make sure that they get the most competitive bid and therefore the highest energy savings possible. And our objective is to try to replicate this model, which has been done in New York City and has been very successful, into a different city across northeastern states and mid-Atlantic states. So for this purpose, we looked first at basic solar project economic factors, size of potential impact, as well as some inputs from our client, in order to break it down to 3 different finalists, being Boston, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C., including the Baltimore area. The reason why we chose Philadelphia was basic logistics. It made a lot of sense given the proximity, and it's a city with over 1.5 million residents, so it just makes sense in terms of impact. The reason then why we looked into Boston was due to the high utility prices there, which provide a good opportunity for energy savings. And then we looked at Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, given the great incentives in Washington, D.C., as well as the political motive being a nonprofit to being established in the capital. Well, you've been able to see already the different 4 criteria that we used for our final assessment, and we looked at those criteria and we rated them based on different characteristics, and good, moderate, and poor. And then one key fundamental aspect of this project was to understand and learn how to take a step back before diving into the work and understand really what the client was looking for, how they created impact, and what our goal with this project was. And we came down with these 4 categories. First, which is very straightforward, looked at the customer base and potential partners within each of these cities to understand impact probabilities. Then we looked at the competitive landscape. We looked at the competitive landscape because this is not a typical private consulting project. It's not about raising competition, but it's about creating additionality. So we wanted to look into a different city where there's nobody really doing that kind of work, so that SolarOne was able to provide the same value that they provided when they were first established in New York City. Third criteria, funding opportunities. SolarOne is a grant-based organization, meaning they are depending on grants in order to be able to operate. So we looked at the cities in terms of the local funding opportunities for energy equity and solar-related projects. And then lastly, we also needed to look at the financial performance for projects in each of these cities, because in the end, if it doesn't make financial return, it's going to be very hard to find ownership structures that work. So in terms of our first analysis, the customers and potential partners were circled every single city with a poor, moderate, and good, moderate, and poor performance. In the case of customers and potential partners, Philadelphia clearly outperformed both Boston and Washington, D.C., with just over 80,000 residents, affordable housing residents, just through the Philadelphia Housing Authority. The reason why Washington, D.C. is circled in yellow and not red is because despite having the lowest number, they had a very strong coalition of affordable housing developers. It's a pretty robust network, so we decided to circle it as moderate because even though the number was lower, there was a good potential for partnership opportunities. And then we advanced this research one step further, and then we conducted a GIS mapping analysis because SolarOne's model works in the way that they try to find clusters of affordable housing buildings in order to engage as many buildings as possible and reduce install cost. So we saw Philadelphia, in line with the previous slide, outperforming both Boston and Washington, D.C. in the terms of affordable housing clusters. The reason why we also map municipal buildings is because our client wants to consider municipal buildings as their potential customers as well. And then in terms of competitive landscape, the additionality criteria that I was talking about, Philadelphia seemed like a pretty good market in sense of competition. We didn't find an organization that was overlapping at all with what SolarOne is trying to accomplish. For Boston and Washington, D.C., we did find some competition, and it's very important to highlight Washington, D.C. and Grid Alternatives. Grid Alternatives being a nationwide organization, which is very established in Washington, D.C., and by very established, we mean they have developed over 2 megawatts already. They have almost the same mission as SolarOne. They even partnered in New York City before, and we found out they're very established with the different affordable housing developers, as well as the local authorities, because they sit on the boards of different affordable housing coalitions with all of those stakeholders. And then in the case of Boston, we did find Resident Energy had a similar mission, but the difference was that Resident Energy was mainly focused on houses of worship / schools and on single family buildings, whereas SolarOne tries to look at the multifamily affordable housing buildings, which is at a larger scale. So it didn't completely overlap, and we considered it to be a moderate result. And then in funding opportunities, it seemed like so far Philadelphia was a clear path and the clear city, but the coming results are going to show why it's important to look at the big picture and why it was important to take a step back and look at those 4 different criteria. Because in terms of funding opportunities, Philadelphia clearly underperformed both Boston and Washington, D.C., Boston being the leader in this category, given that there was a higher volume of foundations providing those grants, so that would facilitate getting that $200K amount that we're showing on the slide, because it would come from a vast majority of sources. Whereas in Washington, D.C., the number of foundations providing energy equity related grants was not as big as in Boston. And then finally, in terms of financial analysis, we performed a different sensitivity analysis for different system sizes, looking at the average system size that would fit in every city, 20 kW being the one that would typically fit across the 3 different cities. And then we look at 2 very key metrics. First, the energy savings, because that's how SolarOne measures impact, not return, but energy savings for the affordable housing residents. And number 2, the debt to equity ratio. And by debt to equity ratio, the reason why it's so important is because if the affordable housing building chooses to own the system and has to finance it themselves, it's going to go through loans. And we want to define structures where this debt to equity ratio could be as high as possible. Because when you're dealing with affordable housing developers, you're dealing with organizations that don't have a lot of cash in their pockets. So you want to make sure you're able to provide that big debt to equity ratio. And the reason why Boston was able to provide the highest, both in energy savings and debt to equity ratio terms, was number 1, because they had very high utility prices, which provides a great opportunity for energy savings. And then number 2, it also had a great financial incentive market for projects that were less than 25 kW and were meant and targeting low and middle income communities. So as I mentioned, it seemed like Philadelphia was starting off pretty well, but by looking at the whole criteria holistically, we found Boston to be the winner of this comparison, outperforming Philadelphia in terms of funding opportunities and financial performance, and then outperforming Washington, D.C. in the financial performance, but clearly on the competitive landscape, given that, as I mentioned, Grid Alternative is a very well-established organization down there. So our conclusion is to move further north and go into the Boston market. So in terms of next steps and deliverables, we're going to provide our client with the comprehensive financial models with a different sensitivity analysis per system size and city that I was talking about. We're going to provide a database of all of the potential partners, grants, and competitors in the market with the different timings in terms of grant applications. And finally, we're going to provide the GIS mapping that you saw before in line with the underlying affordable housing locations, addresses, and the affordable housing developers to make the transition smoother and help them target their customers much more efficiently. This was our presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll take the first question for Paul.
Great presentation. My question is, since this is grant-based, I wanted to know if on the federal level, outside of the cities that you targeted, with Section 8 under affordable housing and HUD, is there a possibility for them to bridge some of the financial gaps so it's less straining on the grant programs and the foundations that this program works with from the federal level through their subsidies? So
usually, so far they've been active just in New York City. So what they did a lot, rather than working with DOE or any other federal division, they work with NYSERDA. So we did look into the different states' funding opportunities and federal funding opportunities, but they clearly underline that the way this works more efficiently is by targeting private foundation. So that's why we focused our research on that.
Hey, Paul, another funding question. Can you talk a little bit more about, is this a comprehensive list, or were you just sort of highlighting the ones that had the highest probability of actually achieving funding? And part of that question is just understanding, was there a way of sort of handicapping it for the client in terms of the probability of actually securing funding from the organizations?
When you say handicapping, you mean targeting just one or two foundations first?
Oh, just saying probability-wise, you guys are extremely well positioned with these two or three, and this is where you should prioritize your efforts in terms of trying to secure funding first.
Yep. The foundations that you see on the slide are just the most representative one in terms of number of projects that they have financed and how active they have been. All of the foundations that we provided, all of the information was for organizations whose mission was energy equity / renewable energy. So what you see on the slide are foundations that have a history in financing and funding those kind of projects. And on the list, of course, is going to be a higher volume of foundations for each city. Yeah. Question.
Okay, Paul. Thank you very much. Okay, so before we end tonight's program, let me say that I thought that this was among the best set of Capstone Workshop presentations that I've heard in my 8 years here. So please give yourselves a round of applause. And I'm going to ask you to clap one more time in just a moment. In recognition of your faculty advisors. Please let me name them. So in non-alphabetical order, Natalie Unwin-Coronary, Dr. Bob Cook, Kizzy Charles Guzman, Suzanne DeRoche, and Thomas Abdallah. Please give them all a round of applause. I'd like to thank those of you who are guests and who watched us on live stream. And let me just say how much I appreciate your dedication and seriousness and devotion to the sustainability and to the projects that you worked on. I really appreciate it. Great job and good luck.